final session for today. My name is Damien Spry from the University of South Australia, and I don't see myself as chairing a panel. I'm going to try and model this on Graham Norton, my favourite talk show host. So I'm going to refer to myself as the host of this discussion today. So if everyone could just take their seats, I'm going to briefly introduce our esteemed panellists before I get them to each talk about their work, and I'll just refer you to their biographies in the literature that's been provided if you want any more details about them. So in brief, we have first of all Professor Fleur Johns from the University of New South Wales, from the Professor of the Faculty of Law there. Secondly, we have Crystal Aberdeen from Curtin University, where she's a Senior Research Fellow and ARC DECRA Fellow in Internet Studies. And finally, we have Dr. Petra Matas. How'd that go? I've learned something today, and that is Czech names, astonishingly complex. So I promised I was going to give it a shot and get it wrong, and so good job. Petra is a Senior Lecturer here at the University of Sydney in the School of Civil Engineering, and also an active member of the Southeast Asia Centre's Executive Committee. So he's one of our hosts for today. So please join me in welcoming our esteemed panel. So the format is I'm going to briefly invite each of our panellists just to talk a little bit about their work and address this underlying question of who's being left behind. And then, time permitting, we'll definitely be opening it up for any questions that people have, and I welcome those and ask you to start thinking about them already. But before I do that, I just wanted to say a couple of opening remarks about this idea of being left behind. And I was thinking about, what does it mean to be left behind? And one of my first thoughts was, the rapture, and everyone gets spirited up to heaven, right? And it's kind of like the digital revolution has come and taken some people off to digital heaven, but then there's some who are just left behind on earth till, they've missed the digital rapture. But that's not quite it, right? Because it's a little bit more complex. So then I was thinking maybe another metaphor is the idea of a wave. And some people catch the wave, some people miss the wave and are left behind, and then some people are just totally dumped on by the wave. So it may be one thing to miss the digital revolution, but maybe another way of thinking about it is the digital revolution can kind of knock you over in one way or another. So that's another way of maybe thinking about how the digital revolution has had different consequences for different people, which is what we're talking about today. So, without any further ado, I will introduce Fleur first, who's going to speak to us a little bit about her research in data science and humanitarianism. So you might want to start talking a little bit about what you mean by data science and humanitarianism, data gathering and analysis and those sorts of things. And then how is this working to support projects that are aimed at or in partnership with those people who are potentially have been left behind. Over to you.
Thanks, Damien, and thanks to everyone involved in today. I've learned a lot already, and I really am grateful for the opportunity. So in terms of where we're coming from, and I say we because I'm here with members of my research team, and I'll speak a little bit about what we're doing to start so you get a sense of where we're coming from. So we're looking at the efforts to adopt and mobilise digital data in humanitarian and development work. And we're looking at that from two sides. We're looking at it from a computer science and statistics side, and that side is led by Wayne Wattke, who's here in the room today. And then myself and Caroline Compton are working more on the way in which this might change legal and political relationships. And that's the data for good or data for development movement is vast and very variegated. So we're taking a particular slice by looking at initiatives within the UN. And a key driver for the uptake of digital data in the humanitarian and development work within the UN is the UN Global Pulse. And so we're very much in dialogue with Pulse Lab Jakarta. So one illustration of the type of work that they're doing, the type of prototypes they're generating, is a platform called HazeGazer, which combines weather and pollution data with social media analysis to try and give governments, in that case the Indonesian government, a better sense of the health effects, people suffering health effects in the face of haze. And so the idea in terms of who is brought in, who has been previously left out and might be brought in by that, the use of digital data in that context, is that people will, the government might have more access to timely data, so there's a sense of people's now experiences or near real-time experiences are brought in, and also that the data might be more granular, so they might be able to get a sense of who and where is suffering in exactly what ways at a particular time. So that gives you a sense of one way of thinking about who and what is in and out that is very prevalent in this area of work, and that is around data. So who has been previously not included that might be included. And then the second way is one that we've heard a bit about already, the idea of benefits and opportunities. So again, Pulse Lab Jakarta is also working on that. They're trying to drive a kind of enabling digital ecosystem where data is seen as a public good, and they're very supportive of open data, data philanthropy and so forth. So in both those senses, it's possible to see inclusive possibilities, but there's also, I want to turn now to this question of who or what has been left behind. So in the data, obviously traditional sampling always was highly selective. So there was always a very small slice, and then you had to try and figure out how to make that stand in for a large slice. But we had a set of methodologies to try and correct the distortion of the sampling. So we had a sense of salient characteristics, say we've heard again some of these, gender, age, education and so forth, and we might try and correct for the sample, so to try and ensure that the sample is representative. But when we're talking about digital data, we can still do that to some degree, but there are other characteristics which might be salient in the selection and sort of axes of inclusion and exclusion that are actually quite hard to figure out. So, for example, there might be types of experiences that are very difficult to record. So some types of experiences, some types of need would be more likely thrown up in a data set. And if we're talking about social media, that's a highly transactional data set. The same issue arises in different ways with satellite image data, mobile phone data, but let me focus on social media because we've been talking about that quite a bit today. So for example, certain types of needs people are not likely to share in a transactional, consumer-oriented relationship that is created online. So you're not likely to go onto social media to say, my husband is beating me up, for example. So certain types of experience, certain dimensions of social and economic condition are, by virtue of the format, more likely to be included in the data set and some are not. And it's very hard to figure out how you correct for those, because you have to have a sense of the whole population in order to figure out how to make it representative. In terms of the second question of who's benefiting or not, something like this, a comparable issue arises. So, of course, the orientation of many, including Pulse Lab, is around entrepreneurship, creative opportunities that emerge, and those are very important, and we can talk about those. But there are lots of other ways in which people are included in the digital economy that don't have that valence. So I'm thinking of the vast labour force, for example, that is working on content moderation and labelling of data. So labelling sexual, racist, violent data. There's a vast workforce. Those people are included in the digital revolution, but they're included in a very different register. They're not driving in the same way. So for that reason, I think old questions of distributive questions and old questions of workers' rights and so forth still remain really salient in this context. And it's important not to get too caught up with one type of inclusion, one register of inclusion, which is this creative mode, and how you enable that, and not think about all the other ways that all the other types of work that people are doing, and what their experience is like. So let me stop there.
So is it possible to get that data about those people?
Yes, so there's really good work being done in social sciences on that commute, but there are lots of other comparable kind of areas which we still don't have a good sense of who exactly, what types of labour should be made visible. Is search, when we enter search terms, is that a labour? Well, you know, we're creating value that's aggregated in certain hands. Should we think of that? Is that working? Are we working when we're entering search terms? You know, there's lots of questions still to be asked around that hook into very old questions of who's left behind.
Yeah, the difference between how people act in social media and how the rest of their lives is a really important one. I'm reminded of a book, I think it's called Everybody Lies, and the general premise is that social media is what we want people to see about us, and actually when our Google searches tell us what we're really interested in or thinking. But then in order to kind of like mine that data, you're starting to impinge on all of these ideas of privacy and consent and those sorts of things. Crystal, your work's fascinating. It's It's got the most intriguing name, Under the Radar, which is also one of my favourite dance hits from about 1989 by Underworld. But I want to know, what's the radar and who's under it? And secondly, you have these evocative terms that you're using in terms of your research. Fandom jacking, 3 I picked out. Fandom jacking, vigilante trolling, and visibility labour. Right. Can you please tell us what that's about? Because I need to know, we all need to know.
I promise I'm writing notes. I'm just the type of human who writes this way and not this way. I'm not like on YouTube or something. To respond to your first question, I want to provoke you on this idea of being left behind. Because you gave us 2 options, the rapture, where you suddenly disappear, and the wave where there's a lag. But the people I study are either the ones doing the leaving behind, so they're the innovators in this space, or they're the people who skillfully manage to be left behind against all odds, right? In the first group, these are people that we think of as social media influencers. Now, every time I say this, especially to an undergrad class that I teach, they think of your pristine, beautiful Instagram model who's there selling you cat food or hair conditioner. But if you think more largely about social media influencers, think about internet celebrities in general. People who are behind the scenes making the memes that we peddle. People who are behind the scenes producing the viral videos that then becomes a stereotype from which the global north talks about, say, South Korea and Psy's Gundam Style, or Japan and a PPAP video. So I'm really looking at these influencers, not just front end, but also back end, who are experts at visibility labor. So to answer your question, visibility labor is the analog side of things whenever we talk about surfacing or existing online. These days, in order to be noticed online, you have to be able to understand the platform, know youth lingo, know cultural lingo, but also understand the algorithm. If you've been on any social media long enough, like Facebook or Instagram, you know that the ads that you search tend to ghostly show up on your feed. You know that not all the people you follow tend to surface in your feed. And these are algorithms at play here that dictate what we get to see. But there's also a human aspect to this. There are lots of young people, influencers, people in media and professional staff who are producing folklore, mass concerted human effort actions around masses of thousands, tens of thousands, who believe that singularly performing the same action would trigger algorithms to work in their favor, or would allow them to slide under the radar of the machine eye. So we're now here looking at 2 things. People who are left behind because they have escaped the machine vision or the machine eye, and people who are doing the leaving behind and innovating and always one step ahead because they're experts at gaming the human eye. They know how to bait for your attention. They know what grabs the headlines. It may look like this is a screen grab of a sex scandal, but if you watch 10 seconds through the video, they're really marketing to you sex and condoms, because that's the way to cut through the noise. So if I were to summarize, I think the work that I do mostly looks at this idea of subversive frivolity. Most of the time, the work I look at tends to be brushed up as frivolous or vain or just young people's play. And while the initial reaction would be to fight against this and claim your right to say you're a useful or productive member of society despite your youth, the actual fact is that a lot of these young people are super happy to be cast as frivolous or vain because this allows them to be underestimated, underachieving in the eye of the state, and therefore under-policed. So they will always stay under the radar despite being logistically public, because in your imagination, you're not a threat. You don't think memes take down political regimes when secretly they have been seeding political sentiment leading up to elections all throughout Southeast Asia. You've got 2 more terms that you've asked me to define. So vigilante trolling is a subset of this. It looks at these people who believe that the state is not able to provide redress, and these usually borders on moral conundrums. Things that cannot really be penalized by law, an act of racism, an act of injustice. So many groups, mostly on Facebook or on forums, come together in the same way that Anonymous has in the past, so disparate groups of people coming together in coordinated efforts in order to use trolling as a weapon. And while the redress you get might be public shaming, widespread discussion on what racism is, what brownface is or isn't, in the long run, although the state doesn't really respond, you get conversations moving, and that's their intent. Your last phrase to me was fandom jacking. If any one of you here here is a K-pop fan, you would know that this is one of the biggest mobilizing factors in all of the world today. K-pop fans are some of the most hardcore investigative journalists, even if they're 13-year-olds working in their bedrooms. I swear, if you've gone into any fandom, they put in a lot of effort. But by virtue of the nature of the contents, because it's idols, because it's pop culture, we cast this aside. If we were to isolate the content and look at the modality, the mediums, their practices, there are world experts in countering misinformation. If a news tabloid comes out and this is their favorite idol, you would see immediately in the next hour all these sentiment waves on social media correcting this information. So fandom jacking, a way that a lot of maybe antagonizers or do-gooders try and hinge upon this long tail of fans who have got these great skills in order to disseminate their messages. So all in all, think about the internet and digital culture as a space with a lot of noise and a lot of saturation. Most of you probably don't even look through every single email or every single Facebook post. But these small young humans are experts at cutting through all the white noise, giving you content that you would be likely to see, and then having you come back for more because you've been baited via all sorts of vernacular strategies.
Yeah, thanks, Crystal. A little while ago, I was up at the QUT Digital Media Research Centre and looking at the Twitter analysis that they do there. And if people are unaware, they have a database of about 500,000 Australian Twitter users at any time, can see what people are tweeting about. And you see the top ranks, and there's always some strange Korean stuff in there, and it's K-pop fans. And this is them trending in the Australian Twitter sphere. So it's kind of like testament to what you said about the powerful organisation behind that area of fandom. So many questions, but I'm going to move on to Petra for our last brief introduction to your work. Now, I did my PhD here about 10 years ago. I was doing it on mobile phone technologies, and at that stage, there was this phrase leapfrogging, which was, it was so hot right then. And the idea was that new technologies would come and it would help address inequalities and inefficiencies and poor infrastructure. And the classic example of this was the mobile phone. People who didn't have landlines, they went from nothing to a mobile phone. Are we still talking about leapfrog technologies? Are they? Is that term of any value? Are people, being left behind by these leapfrog technologies? Who's doing the leaping, and who's being kind of like marginalised by these technologies? And I know you've done some work in this area, especially in the Philippines, related to access to healthy water.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Damien. What I do in terms of who gets left behind, I look at the people at the periphery. And to use your surfing analogy, I would say that it's not the people who really, enjoy the wave and ride the wave and pull all the tricks. But it's not the people who miss the wave, and it's not the people who get dumped on by the wave. If you look at Indonesian farmers or many farmers in Southeast Asia, and that's where I do most of my work, everyone has a mobile phone. They're not left behind. They have the technology close to 100%. They know how to use it. They access the content that they need. But because of their remoteness and because of lack of other infrastructure, they cannot use it, to the point of the professional surfers or the people who pull all the tricks. And from my methodological background, I do this, what is on this picture. I analyze networks, and that's my methodological angle. I don't do the rainbow stuff, but I wish I could. I analyze how information spreads among people and what role technologies play in that. And among farmers in Southeast Asia, I've also got into this research about 12 years ago, and there was a lot of optimism that you mentioned, especially in this peripheral region. We often focus on the core, but in this peripheral region, the idea was that ICTs help to bridge the gap, connect people who are disconnected because of the physical barriers. And so we went into this research with really a lot of optimism, high expectations on how virtual communication can substitute for the remoteness and for the lack of physical transport. But what we have found is that there doesn't seem to be that much substitution. There seems to be more of a case of complementarity. That the people who have higher mobility, they have more dense and extensive social networks to begin with. And these people benefit more from having the access to ICTs and virtual communication because they can mobilize the network better. But the people who are really in the most remote areas and who are expected to benefit most out of having the possibility to connect to the markets and other people far away because there's no one around them, they don't really use these technologies that much because everyone they know is within their walking distance. They have no one to call to, and they wouldn't call someone that they don't know face to face. And so really what we've been seeing is that there's this amplifier effect of complementarity. If you're physically mobile, you benefit more out of this virtual mobility as well. And that's the kind of people that we study 99% of the time, or that people focus on. But if you're a physically remote farmer, you cannot benefit that much from a mobile phone. You cannot, there are famous studies of checking prices in the markets, but if you have no way to get your goods to the market, there's no point. So that's basically the sort of main disappointing message of what we have found so far is that we would hope for leapfrogging, but what we saw is that if you don't have the other type of supporting infrastructure, ICT alone doesn't often do the trick that we would expect.
I might ask you to think a little bit more about some of the, or to talk to us a little bit more about some of the other potential leapfrog technologies that have been raised more recently. So like 10 years ago was the mobile phones, but now in preparation for this event, I was reading a couple of World Bank reports and Asian Development Bank reports, and they talked about things like automation, 3D printing, drone technology, even data-driven capitalism, the type of capitalism that relies upon, similar to what you were talking about, Fleur, the acquisition of data and the processing of that data. It seems to me that some of these technologies are potentially, like, not only leapfrog technologies, but leaping far away from the people who might be able to benefit from them. In other words, if you're potentially hoping to earn money in a factory, but that factory is going to be automated. If you want to be a truck driver, but instead of trucks they're using drones. So is it getting to the stage now where we're not seeing technology as a solution, but we're seeing that as, well, as a way for some people to make money, but for most people who may be young, semi-educated, looking for those types of semi-skilled labour, to be more problematic?
I don't know, but I would be cautious, just based on my experience in studying one type of technology, that there has been so much hype about it and so little empirical support for all the positive and optimistic claims that have been around. You can hear a lot of new terms being thrown around, blockchain this, blockchain that, but I would always be cautious until I see the data, what it's doing.
I actually had a question from the audience at lunchtime, which is, what is blockchain? So,
Russell, are you here?
Does anyone from the panel want to offer a simple definition of blockchain?
It's just a database, isn't it? Because I asked today in the morning someone, what's blockchain? And they told me, it's just a database. I said, okay, I'll use it on the panel, thanks.
Distributed ledger.
Distributed ledger. Okay. Every time I think I have a handle on what blockchain is, I get a new word thrown at me. I don't know what a distributed ledger is, but there you go. Okay. I want to come back this way, why Krista, if I may. On this, it's a similar notion that ability to access or to benefit from the digital revolution is not evenly spread. And we can talk about access to networks, education about technologies, and also understanding of how to benefit from those technologies. That seems to me to be something that we understand when we're talking about things like automated factory systems, but for the people you're talking about, it's equally as important to understand how to use the system in order to benefit from it in the way you want to. And it seems to me, I just invite you to talk a little bit more about how these people who are flying under the radar, but still operating, it's, you know, to use a couple of other military metaphors, I mean, they seem to be either camouflaging what they're doing or some other things like that. In order to do that, you have to be very knowledgeable and sophisticated operators. So maybe I'd invite you just to talk a little bit more about those people who are being willingly, I think we talked a little bit about being willingly left behind, like strategically left behind. So a little bit more on that.
So the analogy I would use is, you know how in the arcades you've got claw machines and then like the hand of death is coming for you and you want to be the toy that doesn't be captured by that death claw in Toy Story? So it's the same thing, like when states survey the landscape and impose yet another law to curtail your digital freedoms online. When platforms introduce a new product that again curtails the ways that you can check or access information. These are the introductions that the social media savvy people I study want to circumvent or want to avoid. To give you a very relatable example, so about 2 weeks ago, those of us who use Instagram in Australia would have realized you no longer see the number of likes on your individual posts. And then I woke up to a dozen journalists panicking and asking, is Instagram going to die out in Australia? Are we still going to have an influencer industry? And they were asking about what panics followed. But if we're really looking at the influencers who were long for one of this because they made an announcement ages ago, there was almost no panic because all of this has been premeditated and pre-planned. If you're following them closely, instead of having likes as the metrics for how your information has been perceived, they would, for instance, be leaving a comment under their own Instagram post and then inviting followers to like that comment as a substitute for liking their post. They would also, for instance, ask a lot of their followers to leave comments, and then the volume of comments became a marker of your populace or your accessibility. You had hardcore fans going, instead of saying, I love you so much in one line, they would leave 5 different comments with this word once each to jack up that. So these sorts of innovations are very small-scaled and boutique or artisanal, so to speak, when they first emerge. But as soon as they catch on, it's like an STD, it just spreads, and then it never goes away, and then we cure it with a really good antibiotic, and then a new thing will come up. So this is the type of innovation we're looking at. Again, it's very hard to convey this because they are performed predominantly by young people, mostly women in this very feminized industry, mostly people who are spread out across the non-global north sites that are innovating with these things. But another thing I want to point out was in a panel that I attended earlier on, we had a really great spread of people, right? We had Bart, who was an industry policy-making person. We had Kristen, who's a journalist and also advocacy person. We had Aim, who was an academic and who studies how people on the ground use social media and politics. But then I felt like we were missing someone who's from a platform or one of those ginormous companies, because these are the folks that we need to hold accountable. If we're really thinking about large-scale Southeast Asia, you can't be tackling individual governments or states. You can't be tackling individual communities or neighborhoods. One day you're going to wake up and Facebook might be the super app like WeChat. You're going to need it to survive, for insurance to make payment. And instead of us having small batch activism here, I think we need to pull on those guys and then make them be accountable for what they're meant to be doing while they're profiting on the side. So I know it's a very tall order and it's like an academic's fairy tale dream list of things you want to do. But if there's a mess of us, of different backgrounds and different stakeholding positions, to also bring them into the conversation, then we don't always have to be reacting to what they're doing next. Instead, we can collaborate. It's easy to block them off an entire ecology, just as many eastern states and eastern countries have. So that perhaps is that missing figure, but I can see why they wouldn't want to be in a space like that.
Well, without giving too much away, I can tell you, if they're not here, it's not because they weren't invited. And just one little interesting point to reflect upon when you were talking about how people would comment in like 3, 4, or 5 different individual comments, individual words in each comment. I have to be careful what I say here. I did some work last year looking at how some educational institutions use social media and looked at all of their Facebook content and the engagement metrics. And you'd see every now and then that a Facebook post would just go off the scale in terms of the engagement metrics. So you go and have a look at that post, that's interesting. And then you'd see exactly this, and there would sometimes be hundreds, Yeah, hundreds, maybe up to 1,000 sometimes, comments, and each of them will be one word, one word, one word, one word, one word. And then you'd look at where those comments were coming from, and the conclusion that I drew was that they had paid a PR company to game the system, and a lot of people in a click farm were using this way to improve the engagement metrics and then boost it up on news feeds. Short Fleur, go for it.
Can I just wanted to push back a little, Crystal, on this idea of people leaving, choosing to be left behind. I think it works quite well when you're thinking in a criminal law mode, which we've been thinking about earlier. But I really wonder to the extent to which the people you're describing and the kind of data brokerage they're engaging in, which is really creative, I agree, and really interesting and worth studying. But I don't know if it's really leaving behind the role of the impact of the law or the role of the state. I mean, it's entering into a logic that's governed, regulated overwhelmingly, highly regulated by contract and IP. And that has a particular, in the 19th and 20th century, with the most prevalent idea of contract, to be really over schematic and broad, is a use of contract as a kind of risk distribution device. And I don't know if people necessarily engage with this. They think of it as an unregulated space, but it is highly regulated, and it's regulated using this technology of contract law, which has a very specific set of purposes, or has been designed around a very specific set of logics. And I'm not sure if we have enough debate around those logics. And we have very much a logic around public law type concerns, so we need to break Facebook up, and I'm all for those debates. And we have a concern with evading the reach of criminal law, but we don't really think about enough, perhaps, public debate around contract law and what is the logic of contract law? What is the range of things that contract law has done and can do? Contract law is not all about selling things to people. There's a whole lot of values and principles that have been built into that architecture. And so maybe the debate, if there was more attention to the ways in which it is regulated already, rather than thinking in these kind of on-off terms, then maybe the debate might become a little bit more nuanced and savvy around regulation as well as around creative cultural practice.
I'm going to ask you to respond to another kind of legal aspect of use of data, and this will be kind of like the last question that I'll ask, so everyone else please get your questions ready, because I'll hand over to you guys next. So it seems to me that one of the things about your project that it emphasised the importance of getting more and better data about people who had previously not been included in ways that kind of left them out of being considered when it comes to those sorts of things. When we are talking about use of data especially in Australia and the US, and especially in the European context, the concern seems to be not that we're being left behind, but that there's too much scrutiny of our data, we're under too much surveillance, and that we don't own that data. So I'm just wondering if I could hear from you, there's two different ways of looking at of data as how data should be treated responsibly, the benefits of being counted versus the problems of being watched. Just some thoughts on that. Is it just the Europeans have different problems to the Southeast Asians? It seems to me to be a little bit more complex than that.
Yeah, no, I don't think the Europeans have, fundamentally different problems. I think it's related to the point I just raised, that that in many ways privacy and concern with surveillance has filled the screen of political debate. And that for good reason. Obviously, the stakes are incredibly high, that debate is very important. But I think in recent years we've seen problems that surface that don't really fit into the ways in which people might want to elicit engagement and attention that are unable to do so, or different questions that are just not about whether someone is seen or not, the extent and the limits of a consent model. When you're talking about data exhaust, using a mobile phone that's analysed in aggregate form, consent just is not there, and privacy doesn't really get it either, because you may not be individually identifiable at all in the aggregate form, but you might still want to be engaged in debate around that process of aggregation and the data brokers that are involved in that aggregation and the purposes for which it's aggregated. So I think it's related to both of your points about there's questions around new forms of aggregates, new forms of community, we might say using old language, or new assemblages of the polity, which we're all participating in. Just as we've participated in old forms like the census, making a population. So we're now assuming new aggregate forms, but we don't always have a vocabulary that really gets to all the questions about how we want to be appearing in that collectively, and what is the form? How are we visualising a public when we're using mobile phone exhaust, for example, rather than a census, or some combination of those two. And so that we're studying people who are working on this exactly to bring to light these questions and work on them, because we're studying people who are engaged in the effort of trying to make useful things for a large number of people, and that's important work. But we also think that there's a lot of further questions embedded in that.
So just before, can I just ask you to maybe explain what you mean when you use that term exhaust? Data exhaust, or sometimes it's called exhaust data. Yeah. So
this would be the data, the metadata, obviously a very well-known term in Australian politics, around if you made a phone call, it wouldn't be, if I'm calling you, Damien, it wouldn't identify us, but it would identify the duration of the call, perhaps the towers from which it was made, and so forth. And when you have that data on a large scale, this is one data set that can be very fruitfully used for understanding, say, for example, in the immediate aftermath of an earthquake in an archipelago like Indonesia or in parts of the Pacific, you want to know where people are. And so you can use this data to figure out where they are in relatively near real time. And that can be very valuable and useful for all sorts of good things. But that's the sort of aggregation that is assuming really great significance in politics and governance. And it's hard to get a handle on what would be the right accountability questions or equity questions to ask in relation to that.
Yeah. And there's a lot of it, there's a lot of this stuff. Questions? Okay, we'll start with one. Okay. How can I say no to you, Natalie?
Sorry. So, yeah, I'm Natalie Pearson and I work with the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre, and I had the privilege of putting together the panels for today. So I just wanted to respond to this discussion about having representation from one of the big, whether it's Facebook or Google or Instagram, one of these big platforms. So I did invite Facebook, and we had some many enthusiastic emails and even a phone call. And we were very keen to have their head of policy for Australia and the Pacific, Mia Garlick, come and speak to us, because I think it would have been a really fantastic opportunity to have a representative from a platform be engaged in a discussion, particularly this question of who and what is being left behind. But unfortunately, after months of conversations, there was just radio silence. And I followed up with a gentle reminder last week, and she was not available. So I guess I do have a question coming out of this. You know, we're dealing with these huge platforms. What can we do when they refuse to engage with us? Because they make the overtures, they perform doing the right thing, being open, being inclusive, the new Facebook community initiative. But when it comes to the crunch of being invited to public forums to discuss these questions, lots of enthusiasm but no actual participation. So how can we get them here?
Well, if UK Parliament can't get Mark Zuckerberg to appear before them, when Rupert Murdoch will, don't feel too bad. Yeah. But does anyone want to take on that general thing about how, either in your research specifically or more generally, a response to what do we do when we feel like we need to engage with these platforms and mega companies?
I can just share anecdotes from my research in the social network analysis community. There are a lot of people who analyze social media data, and I always hear just, we're at their mercy. We have, basically, as researchers, no power, and whatever data we get, it's just the kind of data that they want us to see. And so it raises a big question, so is that data really there? Is that public interest? Should we get more representative view in what is happening, of what they can see? And so far, most people that I know that work on Twitter and other, they are just frustrated that the rules of what they can access can change from day to day, and you know, the company just decides to turn off the tap, and now you cannot see this data, you cannot see that data, and yeah, we're just, you know, they're just playing with us.
I've got several colleagues in internet studies around the world who have quote-unquote left to join the enemy lines. So they've abandoned academia and they're now working in research teams with these companies. And I get the sense that they're enjoying what they're really doing, but you also have to accept the fact that all the change you feel they're about to enact is probably going to be very long-term, very small batches, nothing satisfying or gratifying immediately. So while you're lost in the everyday detail, it'll feel like you're just a cog in the machine. But they all have this hope that in the long run, adding different research perspectives, bringing in academics and people who are on the ground to say cross-industry symposia are the ways that they can manage their limitations and still feel like they're changing the system bit by bit. So it's important to not get used to the helplessness and still try.
Yeah, I guess there are lots of hybrid formations, you know, in terms of in this whole world. So if you look at the ownership of undersea cables that convey a lot of the traffic, for example, that's a complex public-private formation. So there's companies and there's also governments in there, and it's the same with a lot of these. So I think, of course, it's important to tackle and ask hard questions of these companies. But there's so many hybrid formations in this that the questions need to be directed in multiple ways, so I think in multiple directions, and particularly in this area of data philanthropy, data for good, it's sometimes really hard to figure out exactly where and who is the bad guy and the good guy, and it's really a matter of getting to grips with in a particular deal, what's been struck. You know, what is at stake, and what particular configuration of the deal has been struck in this setting, and who's winning and losing in that, roughly speaking. So, and it turns out that some of these companies can be doing really interesting enabling work, and sometimes not so much.
Yeah, Facebook, for example. I mean, Facebook gets a lot of stick for what it does, and it deserves a lot of it. But at the moment, they are both funding research and denying. Well, in 3 weeks from now, on 4th of September, they're going to be denying access to their content and engagement metrics that I've been using for the last 3 years. So there goes my research methodology. We had a question over here.
Susan Benke, University of Sydney. Thank you to a really amazing panelists on an amazing panel. My question is going to piggyback on Damien's question to you, Fleur. In the humanitarian space, there have been concerns about the inaccuracy of data and the use of data for years. So that's not new. But what may be new is the fact that the ability for big data to be collected remotely may mean that some of the quality controls that we used to have on the ground are not there. Question mark. You know, of course, the example that I'll use is in the refugee humanitarian space. We know that a refugee population in a country can be counted in a myriad ways. And in fact, the example that Crystal gives is sort of like how a user is liked, right? It's like the people that are the gatekeepers. They know how to make sure the data work for them, and we try to correct for that in a lot of different ways. My concern is that we will lose more with more data and more distance. And I'd love to hear you answered it a little bit with Damien, but I'm speaking specifically about how that concern manifests in the humanitarian space, because that's what you're looking at. Thanks.
Shall I take that? Yeah. Thanks, Susan. A great question, and that's exactly what, particularly the computer science and statistics side of the project is working on, to figure out exactly how you can make more robust claims, or understand the limits of the claim in a more precise way, and communicate that to decision makers or people who might be making use of data. I mean, in the sort of background work I did for this project, I was looking at counting of refugees and different ways in which that's being done technologically, including using biometric data and so forth. Not necessarily just to count, but also to understand who's coming back for more than their fair fair share of relief or whatever. And in that context, it was really striking. In the 90s, there were all these manuals produced by the UNHCR that guided field staff on all the limits of counting. Like, you know, you won't get the numbers right, there'll be a whole lot of different views, people will disagree, and you're working under emergency conditions in the field, you're never going to get the numbers right. So it was basically about how you agonistically, politically engage the community in that dilemma. So it was all about involving the refugee community in the process of assembling themselves in this place in the middle of nowhere under highly problematic conditions and getting something that could be acceptable to people for purposes of distributing aid, for example. So there was never an idea that we were counting perfectly, that was never the idea. But that expertise that wasn't as present, but I suspect it's building in the way in which the UNHCR was publicly talking about their biometric registration. They weren't saying it's going to be wrong because some people will have, you know, untreated eye disease and the dust will get in and so it will have problems. They were sort of saying the error rate is really low and the contractors are really doing a great job. So there was a lot of emphasis upon the improvement, and that, I'm not saying that's not real, but they weren't really developing the field expertise around how you engage the population in understanding this is what we're doing, it's kind of approximate, it's not going to get everything right, you may disagree, but they didn't kind of describe the process of gathering this population and distributing goods to them as a political process. It was a technical, highly technical process and highly streamlined, and there was a lot of emphasis upon quick decisions. And so I think we're in a process of carrying over expertise that we built up, particularly in statistical settings, over many centuries really, into new settings and building up new forms of that, extending that around the kind of political process of gathering ourselves in different formations for different purposes. So I'm optimistic that that will happen, but I don't think we're there yet in many humanitarian settings. But I am confident that humanitarian agencies understand the problem because they have had this problem in early iterations, but we're just still getting to the nitty-gritty of its particular dimensions and what we can do about it in a digital setting.
Anyone else want to jump in on that, or we'll go to another question? We've got one down the front here.
My question relates to the legality of data ownership and certainly some of the business model of social media. So let's say before the rise of email, if you want to post a letter or a mail to someone, you go to the post office, you pay for a stamp, you mail that letter over. So you pay for that service. You don't expect the post office to open that mail and read it. Now, with email, for example, with Gmail, they're providing that service for free and not paying for that service. But obviously, the question is, I think one reason is you are not paying for the service, so you are the product that Gmail's collecting the data from that sort of thing. Same thing with Facebook, really. So I would say that, you know, from a contract law perspective, when you agree to give up your data in exchange for this kind of free service that you're receiving, what an extent you can argue that you still have ownership over that data?
Who owns our data? Who wants to start with that one? Just while you're thinking of your answers, I've done a little bit of work into this, and I read some research recently which is looking at those terms and conditions. And of course, a lot of those terms and conditions that we assign whenever we start using an app, for example, themselves refer to third parties. So then you have to go and read the third parties' terms and conditions. Someone actually counted how much, it got up to 10,000 pages before you have read everything before you, for signing up for one app. So that seems to be a little bit excessive and unreasonable. Does anyone want to jump in? Who owns our data?
So, I mean, if I understand your question, you're not so much interested in who owns, but exactly what the possibilities are that are embedded in that transaction, that interaction, that contract.
So let's say, so the contract between you and the platform provider is that, yes, I provide my personal data to you in exchange for my service for the connections to my social network. So I think the argument around data protections and data ownership really are concerned about your privacy and your personal information, there are social media platforms that charge you a monthly fee, subscription, in order to provide you with that. So because you are paying their fees, they don't expect they can make money off the fee instead of the data that we provide them into third parties to make them commercialized products.
So I guess let's separate out the question of ownership and what kind of property data might be, which is a complex question, and just stay with the question of the terms and conditions. So again, this is a version, an iteration, although a significant one, of an old problem of what has been called adhesion contracts, because they stick to you. You know, a kind of highly standardized contracts which you are bound by in an instant, and you don't really fully engage with in a way that would make your entry into that contract very meaningful or commensurate with consent in a fully developed sense. So there is this whole repertoire of techniques that have been developed over time that deal with that kind of problem. Some statutory, but also some within the law. So there's been a repertoire of techniques that are trying to deal with things that are unfair. You know, if you strike a bargain that's unfair or unconscionable, the law can correct for that in various ways. So there is a set of techniques, and there's also interesting techniques about the way in which you interact across boundaries. So if you enter into a contract with the interaction between different systems of law. Now, I'm not going to go into all that, but I will suffice to say that there is a repertoire of thinking about these questions and equity questions. Now, and there are people working on this. I think connecting it to old issues and old dilemmas is helpful, but also recognising that that's not going to get us everywhere we need to. And thinking in legislation is important, but also there are these things that can be developed in the courts as well on the basis of existing contract doctrine or in relation to other areas of law. So there is, I think, all the more reason, I think, for, here's a pitch for these kind of forums where people come in with different types of expertise. So that what seems unimaginable is that actually we have a way of doing that. So this is what we do a lot in our project. So we will say, well, we were talking about interoperability and what that means in a computer science setting and what it means in a law setting. Entirely different ways of thinking about that same problem. But the process of bringing those conversations into contact helps, I think, move things forward beyond this sense of despair and beyond the sense of unwarranted hyperbole or, fanciful confidence about everything.
We've probably got time for a brief comment from the other panelists on this kind of issue, if you want to jump in on it. The idea of, it is a major concern that people are worried about, this idea that our data is being taken without our knowledge, used without our permission for purposes that we may not agree with. Is that something that you have to think about when you're doing your research? Or?
Well, often we're on the other side. So what I've encountered in my own research practice is that the companies that we sometimes work with, I don't work with social media companies, but with companies that gather all kinds of data from farmers or from their employees, they're much more ready to share the data than I would expect based on ethical requirements of academia. So whether the research happens or not is less constrained by the willingness of the company to provide data on their clients, their customers, their supposed beneficiaries and employees. Rather, the constraint is, can I really take this from them? Would I be allowed to publish something if they give it to me? And sometimes it surprises me, often, and it seems like, there's this exponential amount of data getting generated every day, and there are more and more companies who come, to engineering faculties, and they're like, hey, we have all this data, can you do something with it? We've been gathering it, and we don't have enough people to do something with it, and we don't actually even know what kind of questions we should ask with it. And it's like, here it is. And then you hear on the news, some issues about privacy concerns and all of that. It's like, how is this reflected in the reality? And that always surprises me. From the other side, at the personal level, I always carry my phone with the location switched off, with the Wi-Fi switched off, and don't connect my Opel card with my credit card because I see what is happening on the other side. But that's just a subjective practice. Yeah.
And Christo, I mean, the people that you know, that are included in your research project and that you've talked about today, they seem to seek to manage a very interesting kind of balance between trying to be noticed and trying to escape notice. That's interesting. Do you think that that's an area that people are going to have to develop skills in more generally, other than, you know, the people you're looking at, they seem to be quite avant-garde in this area?
One of my colleagues, Laura Draper, wrote this brilliant paper on this notion of digital vaccination. It's the fact that many of the people who use these technologies are aware that they're volunteering a lot of their privacy, but at the same time, what can you do? You've got to use these things to survive, in certain economies especially with super apps. But one of the arguments she's pitching is that corporations are cultivating this digital vaccination in generations and cohorts of young people, and that's different. This is a systemic upbringing of populations who are now app-reliant. But by virtue of being an anthropologist, I focus a lot on the folk and people on the ground, so that always gives me a lot of optimism. So I'm immediately thinking about the Dead Drop project by an artist, Aaron Bafal. So all around Europe, places like Berlin, they were sticking USB drives into walls and concrete, and you needed to know which websites to go to so that you could bring your device there, upload, download your information via this USB sticks all around the country or the cities. And you get fun things like games from the 90s, a funny comic, a picture, artisanal art. And the idea was that there are other ways that we can creatively try and circumvent or abandon the networks, the software that we think are part of our daily lives. Of course, this requires a lot of creativity, and here we're most importantly talking about social class. If you've traditionally really belonged in a place where these infrastructures are not in place, then all you have been doing your entire life is circumventing and working with things without the filter of technology. And if you have been in a high echelon of society in terms of your class, then a different form of innovation and circumventing these things comes with technical expertise. So on both ends of the spectrum, we're seeing innovation, but they're also tech with different price tags and then somehow attached to different moral values. So I find a lot of faith going back to the vernacular and how people have been doing it since time immemorial, because, I mean, old is gold sometimes.
That's a pretty optimistic note to end on. We've run out of time. Please join me in thanking our panel.